The sky above Assam Valley stretched vast and empty that morning, painted in shades of pale blue and gold as the sun climbed over the distant peaks of the Himalayas. Second Lieutenant Philip Adair had been airborne for barely 15 minutes. His Curtiss P-40 Newtons Warhawk slicing through the thin mountain air at 8,000 feet. At 23 years old, with 43 combat missions already behind him, Adair knew these skies better than most. He knew how the morning thermals rose from the jungle canopy below, how the haze gathered in the valleys, and how quickly weather could turn deadly over the world's tallest mountains. His P-40, number for 24, bore the name Lulu Belle painted beneath the cockpit in flowing script. But it was the massive white skull adorning the engine cowling that truly defined her character. The Death's Head insignia of the 89th Fighter Squadron, part of the legendary 80th Fighter Group known throughout the theater as the Burma Banshees. They had earned that name through blood and fire, hunting Japanese aircraft through the dense jungles of Burma and protecting the vital cargo planes that flew the treacherous hump route into China. December 13th, 1943. Just another routine patrol. Or so Adair had thought when he taxied out that morning. His squadron was tasked with defending the airfields scattered across northeast India, the critical staging bases for the Allied airlift operation. Without these fields, without the supplies flowing over the Himalayas, the entire war effort in China would collapse. Everyone knew it. The Japanese knew it too. At 9:27, Adair's world changed. He spotted them first as a dark smudge on the eastern horizon, maybe 3 miles distant. At first glance, it looked like a flight of 4 aircraft. Maybe a patrol returning from Burma. But something felt wrong. The formation was too large, too dense. Adair squinted against the morning glare and nudged his throttle forward, climbing for a better vantage point. As the distance closed, his blood ran cold. It wasn't 4 aircraft. It was 64. The formation emerged from the haze like a swarm of locusts, layered and methodical. At the core flew 24 Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally bombers, their twin engines droning in steady rhythm. Above, below, and flanking them came approximately 40 Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighters, arranged in a defensive screen that would make any attack suicidal. They were heading directly toward Dinjan Airfield, Adair's home base. For a moment, Adair simply watched them come, his mind racing through impossible calculations. 64 enemy aircraft, 1 P-40. The math was brutal and simple. Standard doctrine was crystal clear. When outnumbered more than 5 to 1, you called for reinforcements. You shadowed the formation, radioed their position and heading, and waited for help to arrive. You didn't engage alone. That was suicide. Adair checked his radio, already knowing what he would hear. The rest of his squadron was still on the ground at Jorhat, 38 minutes away at full throttle. Other P-42s were scrambling from Dinjan, but they wouldn't be combat ready for at least 5 minutes, maybe 10. By then, the Japanese bombers would be directly over the field, their bomb bay doors already open. Below him, Dinjan Airfield sprawled across the valley floor like a miniature city. 14 C-47 Skytrain transports sat parked in neat rows, each one loaded with critical supplies bound for China. A field hospital occupied the southern perimeter, treating 63 wounded soldiers who couldn't be moved. Fuel dumps held enough aviation gasoline to keep the hump airlift running for 11 days. If those bombers got through, if they hit their target, The destruction would cripple Allied operations for weeks. The Japanese formation droned closer. 2 minutes to bombing range. Maybe less. Adair made his decision. He rolled his P-40 inverted, pulled the stick back into his gut, and dove straight at the heart of the bomber formation. The Allison V-1710 engine roared as the manifold pressure climbed past 54 inches. His airspeed indicator wound rapidly through 300 miles per hour. 320. 340. The P-40 shuddered slightly as it approached its never-exceed speed. But Lulu Belle held together. Solid and true. Adair positioned himself high and behind the bombers, coming at them from their 7 o'clock position with the sun at his back. The Oscar fighters hadn't spotted him yet. Their pilots were focused forward, watching for threats near the target, not expecting an interceptor this far out. Surprise was the only advantage Adair had, and he intended to use every second of it. At 800 yards, with his gun sight tracking the lead bomber's left engine, Adair squeezed the trigger. All 6 of his .50 caliber Browning machine guns erupted simultaneously, their combined rate of fire sending a stream of tracers arcing through the morning air. The P-40 shuddered from the recoil, and brass shell casings tumbled past his canopy like golden rain. His first burst caught the lead Sally bomber perfectly. Rounds walked up the bomber's left wing, tearing through the thin aluminum skin. The port engine exploded in a burst of orange flame and black smoke. The bomber shuddered, rolled slightly to the left, and dropped out of formation trailing fire. But more importantly, the entire bomber formation broke apart. The tight V formation that had been so perfect, so deadly, dissolved into chaos. Bombers scattered left and right, their pilots instinctively breaking away from the sudden threat. Their bombing accuracy, which depended entirely on maintaining formation, was instantly destroyed. Adair had perhaps 2 seconds to feel satisfied before the world erupted around him. 40 Oscar fighters were diving toward him like angry hornets, their lightweight airframes giving them an acceleration advantage the heavier P-40 couldn't match. The Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar was one of the most maneuverable fighters ever built. Powered by a radial engine producing 1,150 horsepower, it could turn inside anything the Allies could put in the air. Japanese pilots called it the Hayabusa, the Peregrine Falcon, and they flew it with aggressive confidence. Adair pulled hard, rolled right, and dove away. 7 Gs pressed him into his seat, crushing the air from his lungs. His vision grayed at the edges, but he kept the stick buried in his lap. The P-40 responded, pivoting through the sky with the ponderous grace of its heavier airframe. 4 Oscars flashed past his canopy, so close he could see the rising sun emblems on their wings. Standard tactics against the Oscar were simple and absolute. Never try to turn with them. Use speed. Hit and run. Extend away. Gain altitude. Reset. And attack again. But Adair couldn't extend away. If he fled, even for a moment, the bombers would reform and complete their attack. He had to stay close. Keep them disrupted. Keep them afraid. He rolled left, pulled the nose up, and fired a 2-second burst at an Oscar diving toward him. His rounds missed high, but the Japanese pilot broke away. Unwilling to press through the stream of .50 caliber fire, another Oscar attacked from below. Adair rolled inverted, dove past it, and pulled out heading back toward the bombers. Behind the fighter screen, the Sally bombers were attempting to reform. 3 groups of 6 aircraft each were closing back together, trying to re-establish the tight formation they needed for accurate bombing. If they succeeded, they would press the attack. Adair had perhaps 90 seconds before they reached their release point over Dinjan. He shoved the throttle to the firewall and dove toward the bombers again, ignoring the 8 Oscars that immediately turned to intercept him. The P-40 accelerated to 405 miles per hour in the dive, faster than the Oscars could match. Adair opened the gap, pulled out at bomber altitude, and lined up on the right-hand sally formation. 300 yards, he fired. His tracers converged on the lead bomber's right engine. The Mitsubishi radial exploded in a spectacular fireball, and the bomber rolled hard right, streaming flames and debris. Its wingman broke formation to avoid collision, and once again the Japanese attack dissolved into chaos. But this time, Adair paid the price. As he pulled up from his attack run, the Oscars caught him. Multiple fighters opened fire simultaneously. 7.7mm rounds hammered into his aircraft. Adair heard the impacts, felt Lulu Belle shudder under the hits. His right wing fabric tore, exposing the aluminum structure beneath. One round severed his right aileron control cable, and suddenly the aircraft wanted to roll right. He had to hold constant left pressure on the stick just to keep his wings level. More rounds walked up his fuselage. One punctured the coolant reservoir behind the firewall. Instantly, green coolant sprayed across his windscreen, obscuring his vision. Adair craned his head to see through the side panels, watching in growing horror as his engine temperature gauge climbed past the red line. Steam began erupting from the cowling seams where the metal panels joined together. His oil pressure gauge began dropping. First slowly, then faster. The Allison engine's lifeblood was leaking away, pouring from shrapnel holes he couldn't see. Without oil pressure, the engine would seize. Connecting rods would weld themselves to the crankshaft. Pistons would freeze in their cylinders. The engine would simply stop, transforming his fighter into a very heavy glider over extremely hostile territory. Adair chopped the throttle, reducing power to try to save the dying engine. But the moment he reduced power, he began losing altitude. 1,000 feet per minute. Then 1,500. The Oscars circled above him like vultures, waiting. Then flames erupted from his engine cowling. Fire in an aircraft is every pilot's nightmare. But fire in a liquid-cooled engine follows a predictable and terrifying sequence. First, burning coolant vaporizes and ignites. The flames spread forward along the engine, cowling, drawn by the airflow. If the fire reaches the fuel lines running along the engine's left side, the entire aircraft explodes. Pilots usually have about 30 seconds from first flame to catastrophic structural failure. Adair had perhaps 20 seconds of life remaining. The standard procedure was immediate engine shutdown and bailout. But Adair was only at 8,000 feet and descending rapidly. Below him stretched unbroken jungle where Japanese patrols operated freely. Allied troops called it the Green Hell, a maze of vegetation so dense that downed pilots could vanish without a trace. Even if he survived the parachute landing, his chances of rescue were slim to none. He kept the engine running. The fire intensity increased. Flames now visible, licking around the cowling edges. Adair reached for the mixture control and pulled it back to idle cutoff for 3 seconds. Starving the engine of fuel, the flames died down slightly. He pushed the mixture forward again. The engine coughed, sputtered, caught, and continued running. But rough now, producing maybe 60% power. Not enough to climb, barely enough to maintain level flight. He was committed now to either flying this burning, crippled aircraft back to base, or dying in the attempt. Behind him, the Sally bombers had given up. Individual aircraft were turning southeast, heading back toward Burma. The raid was broken. Dinjan airfield was safe. Adair had accomplished his mission. Now he just had to survive it. He turned southwest toward his base at Nguli, 43 miles away. About 15 minutes of flight time, assuming the engine kept running. 6 Oscars followed him for a while, watching, waiting for the inevitable. One Japanese pilot pulled alongside, close enough that Adair could see his face. The enemy pilot gestured downward. Land. Surrender. Become a prisoner. Adair ignored him and flew on. At 6,000 feet, his engine oil pressure dropped to absolute zero. The gauge needle pegged against the stop and stayed there. The engine should have seized immediately, but somehow it kept turning, running on momentum and whatever microscopic oil film remained coating its internal components. The vibration increased. The propeller began windmilling unevenly. Smoke filled the cockpit, burning Adair's eyes and throat. Then his right aileron control cable snapped completely. The aileron flopped to full deflection, and the P-40 rolled violently right. The nose dropped into a dive. Adair hauled back on the control stick with both hands. Nothing happened. The elevator cables were damaged too. He had no pitch control. The nose stayed down. His airspeed increased rapidly as the jungle rushed up at him. 2,000 feet. 1,800. 1,500. Then, in a moment of desperate inspiration born from pure survival instinct, Adair saw the solution. The damaged aileron was forcing the right wing down. The broken elevator was stuck in a nose-down position. Gravity and aerodynamics were pulling the aircraft into an uncontrolled dive. But aerodynamics work in both directions. If he rolled the aircraft completely inverted, the damaged aileron would force the right wing up instead of down. The elevator, stuck pointing the nose down, would push the tail down and lift the nose up when flying upside down. Flying inverted would reverse all the control inputs. The damage that was killing him right side up might save him upside down. At 1,800 feet above the jungle canopy, Adair rolled Lulu Belle completely inverted. -1 G pressed him against his shoulder straps. Blood rushed to his head. His vision turned red around the edges. The fuel system, designed for positive G loads, struggled to feed fuel to the engine while inverted. The Allison coughed, sputtered, nearly quit, then caught again. The nose came up. The descent slowed. At 1,200 feet, the P-40 leveled out, flying upside down at 140 miles per hour. Adair held the inverted attitude for 40 seconds, gaining altitude, 50 feet per minute, but climbing. Then fuel starvation returned. The engine began cutting out. He rolled right side up, and immediately the damaged controls pushed the nose down again. The P-40 descended, 600 feet per minute. Adair waited until he lost 300 feet, then rolled inverted again. The nose came up. He climbed 200 feet before fuel starvation forced him right side up. The pattern repeated, upside down to climb, right side up to let fuel feed properly, flip, climb, flip, descend, over and over. The 6 Oscars that had been following him backed away, their pilots clearly deciding that the American pilot was either insane or already dead. Either way, they weren't going to waste ammunition. They turned east toward Burma, leaving Adair to his fate. Adair continued his bizarre rolling flight toward Naguli, alternating between inverted climbs and right-side-up descents. His fuel gauge showed 83 gallons remaining. His oil pressure gauge had been pegged at 0 for 9 minutes now. By every law of physics and engineering, the engine should have destroyed itself. That it continued running defied all mechanical logic. At 5,000 feet, Adair spotted Naguli airfield ahead. The runway, the tower, the revetments, safety. But his ordeal wasn't over. His landing gear was hydraulic, powered by the engine. With the engine producing minimal power and possibly seconds from complete failure, he might not have enough hydraulic pressure to extend the gear. He pulled the gear lever. Nothing happened. The main wheels remained locked in the up position, tucked into their wells beneath the wings. Adair reached for the manual hand pump, a backup system that required 28 strokes to manually pressurize the hydraulics. But operating the hand pump required both hands, and releasing the control stick meant losing aircraft control. His damaged ailerons and elevator would immediately push the nose down. Adair thought fast. He reached behind his seat, pulled his lap belt loose, and wrapped it around the control stick. He looped it through the seat frame and pulled it tight. The makeshift rig held the stick in approximately neutral position. Not perfect, but enough to keep the aircraft flying mostly straight. He grabbed the hand pump with both hands and pumped hard. 5 strokes. 10. 15. At stroke 23, he felt resistance. Hydraulic pressure building. At stroke 28, he heard a mechanical thunk from beneath the cockpit. The left main gear extended and locked. 3 seconds later, the right main gear followed. But now, with the gear down, drag increased significantly. His airspeed fell from 160 miles per hour to 135. Still above stall speed, but not by much. The engine, already on its last legs, was now producing perhaps 40% power, barely enough to maintain altitude. Naguli runway was 7 miles ahead. 3 minutes if the engine kept running. If tower operators at Naguli saw him coming, a P-40 with smoke trailing from the cowling, flying erratically, gear down. They assumed he would make a normal approach, lower the flaps, reduce speed, touch down smoothly. But Adair's flaps were hydraulic too, and he couldn't generate enough pressure for both gear and flaps. The gear was down. The flaps stayed up. Landing without flaps meant higher landing speed. 120 miles per hour instead of 90. That meant longer landing roll. Naguli's runway was 4,000 feet long. A flapless landing in a damaged aircraft required at least 3,000 feet. Doable, if he maintained airspeed. If the engine kept running, at 2 miles from the runway, his engine kit, the propeller windmilled to a stop. No power, no thrust. The P-40 became a glider with a glide ratio of approximately 8-to-1 under normal conditions. From 2,000 feet altitude, he should be able to glide approximately 3 miles. The runway was 2 miles away. Theoretically possible. But his damaged aircraft had extra drag from the battle damage. Bullet holes in wings and fuselage disrupted smooth airflow. His actual glide ratio was worse than normal. He wasn't going to make it. Then Adair remembered something from training. Something about P-40 glide performance while flying inverted. At specific angles of attack, inverted flight could produce less drag than right-side-up flight, potentially extending glide range. The principle had been mentioned briefly. No instructor had expected pilots to actually use it. Adair had nothing to lose. He rolled inverted at 1,800 feet, 1 mile from the runway threshold. Blood rushed to his head. His vision tunneled. He held the inverted attitude, watching the jungle pass above him or below him. Perspective became meaningless. His descent rate improved from 700 feet per minute right side up to 500 feet per minute inverted. On the ground, Technical Sergeant Robert Martinez watched through binoculars as an inverted P-40 approached with landing gear extended. His first thought was that a Japanese pilot had stolen a P-40 and was attempting to strafe the field. He ran toward the nearest .50 caliber machine gun position. Adair was at 400 feet altitude, half a mile from the runway threshold. Still inverted. His vision was fading. Gray tunnels closing in from the edges. Carbon monoxide poisoning and negative G-forces were shutting down his brain. He had perhaps 15 seconds of consciousness remaining. At 200 feet altitude, 300 yards from the threshold, Adair rolled right side up for the last time. The damaged aileron immediately pushed the right wing down. He countered with left stick, fighting the aircraft, forcing the wings level. The nose wanted to drop. He pulled back with what little elevator control remained. The P-40 descended toward the runway at a steep angle, nose high, wings wobbling. Martinez held his fire. The aircraft was clearly damaged, clearly struggling. It might be friendly, it might be enemy, but something told him to wait. Adair crossed the threshold at 90 feet, descending rapidly. Too fast. Too steep. The main wheels hit the concrete runway hard. 7G impact. The gear struts compressed fully, bottoming out with a bang that could be heard across the field. The tail wheel slammed down. Metal shrieked. The right main gear, weakened by battle damage and the heavy landing, collapsed. The right wing dropped, its tip scraping the concrete in a shower of sparks. The aircraft ground looped right, spinning 180 degrees, sliding backward for 200 feet before finally stopping. Fire crews raced toward the aircraft. Adair sat motionless in the cockpit for 12 seconds, his hands still gripping the control stick, his mind trying to process that he was alive and on the ground. Then muscle memory took over. He released his shoulder straps, stood up, and climbed out onto the wing. His legs buckled the moment his weight was on them. Ground crew caught him before he fell. They opened the cowling. The Allison engine was destroyed beyond any hope of repair. Pistons ceased. Crankshaft varped. Oil pan ruptured. Coolant everywhere. They counted the damage. 16 bullet holes in the fuselage. 7 in the right wing. 4 in the left. The right aileron control cable severed completely. The hydraulic reservoir punctured. 2 electrical bundles cut. Every cylinder showed scoring. 3 connecting rods welded to the crankshaft. The coolant system destroyed. Lulu Belle would never fly again. But Philip Adair had saved Dinjan Airfield. Intelligence reports confirmed that all 24 Sally bombers had turned back without dropping their ordnance. The Japanese formation had scattered 15 miles short of target. 0 bombs hit Allied facilities. 0 casualties on the ground. The hump airlift continued without interruption. 3 days later, 10th Air Force Headquarters interviewed Adair about the engagement. Flight surgeons discovered that carbon monoxide levels in his blood were still elevated 72 hours after the mission. They determined he had been flying with severe carbon monoxide poisoning for the final 11 minutes of the flight. That level of impairment should have rendered him unconscious. How he remained functional remained a mystery even the doctors couldn't explain. On January 8, 1944, Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell presented Second Lieutenant Philip Adair with the Silver Star. The citation was brief, as military citations tend to be, but the words carried weight. For gallantry in action against enemy forces when Lieutenant Adair, flying alone, engaged and disrupted a formation of 64 enemy aircraft, preventing destruction of critical supply facilities. Adair flew 95 more combat missions with the Burma Banshees. He achieved ace status with 5 confirmed kills. On his final mission in July 1944, he shot down 2 key 43 Oscars over northern Burma. He returned to the United States in September, survived the war, and remained in the Air Force for 30 years, retiring as a full colonel in 1971. The P-40 Warhawk never achieved the fame of the P-51 Mustang or P-47 Thunderbolt. It was slower than both, couldn't fight effectively above 15,000 feet, and by 1943 was considered obsolete. But in the hands of determined pilots like Philip Adair, the rugged Curtiss fighter proved what mattered most in combat wasn't the aircraft's specifications on paper. It was the courage, skill, and sheer stubborn refusal to quit of the pilot flying it. One pilot, one obsolete fighter, 64 enemy aircraft. December 13th, 1943. The day Philip Adair proved that impossible odds mean nothing when someone simply refuses to accept defeat.